I'm Blake Hargreaves, and this is Future Stops. You're hearing a performance by the musician known as Charlemagne Palestine. Born in Brooklyn in 1947, Palestine's career spans 6 decades, during which he's kind of done it all. From playing hand drums at poetry readings with the likes of Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso as a teenager, to helping reshape American contemporary music in the 1960s alongside people like Terry Riley and Philip Glass. He also played a role in developing some of the first commercial synthesizers, and since the 1970s has continued exploring the sonic potential of the pipe organ in churches and concert halls around the world. Today on Future Stops, we visit with Palestine to discuss his fascinating life and career. As a multidisciplinary artist, he's explored many avenues in his long history of making music. Just don't call him a composer.
I don't like that word. I try never to use that word. I don't know why, but the word, maybe because I've seen too many people who are composers and been to concerts that are sort of dry, and the word since I was young, I never enjoyed that word used in context with what I do. So normally I always say something like sound artist. I don't know. I mean, I do a lot of things. I like to call myself these days a Gesamtkünstler. A Gesamtkünstler is a word which means an everything artist. It comes from the time of even Wagner, and so it's like a Gesamtkunstwerk is a total artwork or a musical work or theatrical work. So I like to call myself sometimes a Gesamtkünstler, which in German Künstler means artist, so it means like an everything artist. I started early in New York City. I was born in Brooklyn, and I went to a whole lot of different schools in New York City. I went to Parsons School of Design. I went to the New School of Social Research. I went to Mannes College of Music. I went to a little bit to Columbia University, New York University. I went to Pratt, which is an art school in Brooklyn. And then I eventually, in the late 60s, when I was already about 23 years old, I was invited from Columbia University, from New York University by a composer of electronic music called Mort Subotnick. And he invited me and a whole bunch of others of us to California to a new school that Disney family had a big endowment to make called California Institute of the Arts. And then I moved to California for some years. Then I came back to New York. But I started as a singer of music from Jewish background, because I'm from a Jewish family, and then I got involved quickly with Indian music, and I started to sing Indian music, and I fell in love with drones from the Indian tambura and harmonium, and that was the sound side. And then I started to invent a music, which in those days it seemed like there were a whole bunch of us who either knew each other or didn't know each other, who were inventing a kind of continuum music. And some of them eventually, because of Tom Johnson, the reviewer of the Village Voice in those days and composer, used the word that they used for visual artists, minimal art. He began to use that word for people like me, which is, again, another of the bugaboos. I hate that word. Because I do deal in continuums, and sometimes my works were 4 or 5, 6 hours long, and sometimes they use similar intervals, but they're always in my works. I always feel like they're always in transformation, and I'm always looking for the maximal effect. So that word always turned me off, and it made me think like when you're in a taxi and you don't leave the taxi man any tip, that's the minimum for me. Already very early, going back to the continuum and the drone and the harmonium and the tambura, as we are talking about the organ, already around 1966, I began to put little pieces of cardboard between the keys of organs. And I love to hear them sonorize for hours and hours. And I was only about 17 years old. And that was my first response to that, to those instruments. I played the bells, a carillon is what they call it. I got a job when I was at the High School of Music and Art, even before my universities and things. I went to the High School of Music and Art in New York City. And one of my girlfriends turned me on to a guy who played the bells next to the Museum of Modern Art on 53rd Street, Fifth Avenue. I played that every day for people who were walking down the streets of Fifth Avenue, and I invented a music for it. That started around 1964. In that church, of course, it has one of the most beautiful organs in New York City, and they wouldn't let me touch that organ. But I did get to know, during this whole period, I became a sort of like an apprentice for organ tuners. And so I didn't get to be where the keyboard was, but I got to be up in the kitschkit of the machine. So anyway, bells got me to organs, not in the keyboard, but up in the tunings. And so that, again, that connected very much with how synthesizers work, because I loved using oscillators to build my continuums back then. And then it turns out, that an organ some organs can have thousands of oscillators, which in synthesizer world, if you had, like I had at the time when I was at CalArts, maybe 20 oscillators, that was over. You were already Santa Claus. You had, but for organs, if you imagine each pipe, there can be thousands. Sometimes what you call a sound, a timbre, in an organ is made from 4 or 5 pipes at the same time. That creates the particular flavor, color of the sound. So it was inevitable that I would fall in love with the organ at a very young age. But because of my alternative way of looking, my alternative way of thinking, my alternative way of talking, I was not organist kind of person.
In the 1960s and early 70s, Palestine's unconventional approach, while not really appreciated by the organ culture of the time, was highly sought after in the early days of the synthesizer. It was these experiments in electronic music that ironically led to his first opportunities to perform on the pipe organ.
Over the years, it turned out that gradually people who began to hear what I was doing, especially in Europe, were amazed at what I was able to make sounds do very simply by their own chemistry, that they would find organs and people in churches that would allow me to work and do some important experiments, which happened in the late 70s for the first time in a place called Delfzijl in the north eastern part of the Netherlands. There in 1977 that I had the ability to go to this little village and work for a few weeks and create what would become known as my famous gobbledygook title, Schlingenblangen, which actually doesn't mean anything, except that it was in the days, I was a student of the days of Xenakis and Stockhausen and Feldman and Cage and Ligeti. They all had these bloptical titles. So I was jealous. I said, well, I can have a bloptical title too. And so I created Schlingenblangen with an even umlaut on the Blangen A of the second word. If you look on the internet and you put Schlingenblangen, you find the work of Charlemagne Palestine since the 70s on organs all over the world. So that nonsense word became the title of my investigation. It isn't, and again, against the word composing, it's not a composition, it's an investigation with that title, meaning that every organ I go to and I do a Schlingenblangen, it's a way of discovering, experimenting with the instrument as it is and trying to create over a certain period of time in the architecture of either a church or a theater where that particular organ is.
These investigations are more than just musical. For Palestine, the process of making music is a sacred, divine ritual and is directly connected to the sacredness he finds in the everyday objects all around him.
Everything I touch, like the Midas touch, for me comes sacred. For me, that I am an artist of the sacred. Even if I use things that some people would say, "But that's ridiculous. That's not sacred." Yes, I just touched it. It's sacred now, and I'm not joking. So the sacred part of working in churches was not the problem. That I always respected. And as I spent many of my early childhood, like singing in synagogues, which is a cappella. You can't even have an organ or a piano or an instrument. The voice is the only instrument permitted. But I was already, for me, architecture, I even preferred to play or perform in churches or in industrial spaces that have the kind of resonance like churches do, and not in theaters and concert halls that are drier. And I find, and the seating, everything's so formal. I actually prefer to perform in sacred buildings, of which, of course, the most popular and the most abundant are churches. Some churches give me carte blanche that I can at least transform it for an afternoon or an evening, but some are very uptight, so I can only transform my keyboard or and different elements. Sometimes I like to do little ceremony with crystal glasses and some alcohols, which is perfectly in the same vein as the communion, but exactly that. Sometimes that frightens people of the church, that I'm doing some kind of alternative communion which doesn't fit into their system, and so maybe it's subversive, which I don't believe so, but so I have to always play with these possibilities but less and less. I mean, I must say less and less, because churches are trying to be hipper and hipper.
A perfect example of one of these ritual performances can be heard on his recent album, The Organ is the Greatest Synthesizer Ever. It's a live recording that transitions from solo voice to percussive pipe organ to playing sustained sounds for color and texture. A performance that seems to mirror the trajectory of his own life in music and was shaped by the realities of the organ he was playing.
In Eupen, came across this organ that had many, many problems, and it was set up that I would do a performance in an afternoon. I had very short time to rehearse, but immediately I felt this, and I already have 50 years of experience with all different organs all over the world. So, and all the organs are different. So I'm used to difference. I'm used to doing it I don't have months. I sometimes do it in hours. Sometimes I have a couple of days, but often I have only a few hours. And that's what I had in Eupen. And this organ and I just hit it off. And everything that it couldn't do, I finally realized I didn't really need. And everything it could do was superb. And so I did this performance, not at all imagining that it would sometime after come out. I was just trying to get through that Sunday. I think, damn, I hope that I'll be able to do all the things I want to do before it either dies or die, meaning like sometimes the blower of an organ that that's a little bit tired. If I play too many notes, I don't hurt it, but the blower goes, and eventually it needs to be looked at and repaired. But nothing ill happened, and afterwards they sent me the recording. And I was shocked because I was just trying to get through this performance and give because it was a full house, but it wasn't such a big church. There were maybe 300 or 400 people, young people, again, if I may say, in this church. And they sent me a couple of weeks afterwards a recording, and it was magical. So, and that happens from time to time, that I quickly find the magic in the instrument, the stops, the pipes, and I try to transform them the least possible. All I do is put them into continuums. Well, the system, normally I have a few sheets of normal A4 paper or a little booklet, and I quickly try out all the organ in this case and see which stops are working, which ones aren't. I bring little paper circles that you can write on, and I number the different the keys and the stops. So I test their overtone and intensities. I start with the ones which are the quietest and the calmest, and then gradually I add. But I do that already very quickly, so I know while I'm performing, I go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8, and I've already tested, so I know that gradually it will, unless I want to do a performance that is not so like the waves start small and then they get larger. Sometimes then I can go from 2 to 10, from 8 to 30, which sometimes I've done. It depends the energy of the space and the time.
So this piece, the organ is the greatest synthesizer ever. Is it an improvisation? Did you have a lot of time to prepare with that organ?
That's another word I don't like, improvisation, because they use it for everything. I always thought there should be more words for when you don't do something, reading it from a book or from a score. But they never did come away with many versions. So, yes, as I was explaining, I didn't know, first of all, that the organ had problems. And when I arrived, they said, oops, we didn't tell you, but this organ has problems. And so it's not the first time, as I have explained. I've been with so many organs, and some of them have problems, and so I try to work around these problems. And so I had not a long time, but I created a system very quickly, followed my system of continuum, and created an event. Some of the registers didn't work at all, but it just happened that all the registers that did work were the kind of registers that I loved, and they did beats and combinations that were beautifully poetic, which I didn't play. I just my favorite is when there are sonorities that I let continue together and they play themselves, and you think you're hearing like arpeggios and enormous amounts of fluctuations that I'm not doing at all. The sounds are doing it with themselves. And what happened is at the end of this performance, which I have started to do over the last few years, while everyone was clapping, I said, the organ is the greatest synthesizer in the world, or sing. And that's how I ended the performance. I don't like when people clap right after an hour of like sacred, like magical music. So I often do what I can to not yet give the sense that it's over. So there were like maybe 30 seconds at least of silence before the clapping. And as people were clapping, I spoke of, as I do lately, say that the organ is the greatest synthesizer ever. And that became the title of the disc.
You're listening to the Future Stops podcast, an initiative of the Royal Canadian College of Organists. I'm Blake Hargreaves, and I'm your host as we explore the world of the 21st century organ. We just heard today's feature piece, an excerpt from Charlemagne Palestine's "The Organ is the Greatest Synthesizer Ever." On the surface, Charlemagne Palestine has very little in common with musicians of the past who spent much of their lives like him on the pipe organ, like J.S. Bach. But his connection to the craft from the age of 15, when he was playing carillon concerts daily on the Upper East Side, and his mastery of a personal system of the sacred, occult, or numinous, just like Bach's deep use of numerology in his works, shows us how much they really do have in common.
What do they say? The beauty is in the eye or ear of the beholder. Everybody, Bach, everybody's gaga. And it's very beautiful music. So, I mean, I also love the musics of Bach or other composers of church music. Sometimes I find that they're a little bit overbooked, if anything, that there's not enough imagination now in finding alternatives or complementaries to traditional sacred music. We're talking about organ, so let's say organ. But gradually there are people from a new generation, like there's Michelangelo and there's Mark Rothko. There are people who like only the things that came from long ago, but there are also some interesting new paths that artists created more recently. And they're not always the same appreciator, let's say. And also, that was another thing that I didn't like about the composer thing, is that there can be an evening of performance that starts with Bach, a Beethoven, then a Tchaikovsky, a Mozart, and then a Charlemagne Palestine. And when you go to performances like that, and I go to it with my wife, we go to a lot of traditional performances. It's always the new work, like everybody's coughing, and because it really isn't their thing. And to just hear something for the first time done after you've heard all these other like great giants of the history of music, it isn't really fair. So that was another reason I avoided and invented a system where I can play either with other people of my generation or have an evening all to my own. And that works better because then you have the time to enter my world without itchty bopshty boopshty from one era, one genius to the next. And I'm somewhere in the middle. Or not only me, but any musician, composer of now.
Charlemagne Palestine's artistic world reminds us of the essential point of art, to express ourselves and offer to others not only the opportunity to partake in enjoying that expression, but to give others permission to express their secret truths as well. Every time someone shows who they are in a performance context, the world becomes a better and more interesting place. We look forward to having the opportunity to see Charlemagne Palestine perform again when that is possible. And this concludes our first season of Future Stops. It's been wonderful learning so much about the creative and fresh approaches that artists and organizers are bringing to the pipe organ and its audience all over the world. We're looking forward to having you with us for Season 2, which begins in September. We'd like to thank Charlemagne Palestine for joining us on Future Stops and all of the guests this year. If you'd like to learn more about Palestine's music or any of our past guests and their projects, all of the links and info can be found on our social media pages. We have a Future Stops podcast Facebook page, an Instagram account, and our Twitter account is @FutureStopsPod. We hope you'll join our community in one or all of these places so we can keep in touch while preparing our next exciting season of stories about the world of the 21st century organ. Future Stops is a podcast from the Royal Canadian College of Organists, produced by Andrew O'Connor, with Haley Raymond as community manager and executive producer Elizabeth Shannon. I'm your host, Blake Hargreaves. Thank you for listening.